Greetings and welcome back to Church in the World. This is part 3 of our discussion of peace and our 4th week of this series. We're looking at the ELCA's 1995 social statement on peace, and we're looking at tasks. We've talked about the basis of peace. We've talked about the general international situation, the cultural moment, or at least as it was in 1995, which, while there are certainly some things that have exacerbated, more or less remains the same. So what do we do? Well, the social statement covers 3 basic areas, which is already foreshadowed: culture, economy, and politics, and tasks for each of those areas that will create peace. So first, a culture of peace. One, we foster a dynamic vision of difference in unity, right? We're called to engage differences, not ignore them and not fear them. And what does this look like? It means learning from each other. It means talking across religious differences. It means not allowing religion to be used to incite people to violence. It means hoping for earthly peace by challenging people to strengthen their own particular communities in ways that promote respect and appreciation for people in other communities because of our shared and common humanity. So what that means is seeing people as people, right? Seeing all people in their amazing diversity as God's creatures and sinners for whom Christ died, right? Jesus died for every single person you have ever hated. Jesus died for the person who most ticks you off, even if it's me, even if it's yourself. Jesus died for these people, for all people. And so we need to overcome hostility and promote respect for human rights as well, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Right. So we oppose genocide and other violations of human rights such as torture, religious and racial oppression, forced conscription or impressment, forced labor, and war crimes, including organized rape. We provide for the most basic necessities of the poor. We defend the human rights of groups most susceptible to violations, especially all minorities, women, and children. This alone is enough to blast to pieces a vast majority of the political nonsense going on in our national discussions right now. Think about that. We oppose genocide, torture, religious and racial oppression, forced conscription, forced labor, war crimes, including organized rape, provide for the most basic necessities of the poor, and defend the human rights of groups most susceptible to violations, especially minorities, women, and children. Done. If our government and if our society could agree that that is a cultural value, doing those things, so much of our discussions would shift from whether or not to do that to how to do that. How do we go about doing that? How do we go about opposing genocide and violations of human rights? How do we provide for the most basic necessities of the poor? How do we defend human rights of groups who are most vulnerable? And then we counter and transform attitudes that encourage violence, fear of others, disregard for people's dignity, personal experiences of violence, all of these things that help form attitudes that encourage violence. It also references images in movies, television, videos, and music. Whether or not that's actually a thing that exists has been a matter of some debate, but it's true. The more we glorify violence, we can subconsciously come to see it as normal until all of a sudden it's very much not, right? And that can happen whether we're seeing it on the television or whether we're being exposed to it in our family life or our work life or our church life. We strengthen the will and the ability to resolve conflicts peacefully, right? Disagreements, conflicts, and competition are inevitable. Wars are not. Okay? We need to commit to nonviolent resolutions of these things. And another ingredient is the ability to explore all avenues for common interests, to compromise our interests, to conciliate differences, to prevent, moderate, or isolate destructive conflicts. In other words, learn to, through education and practice, especially with children and youth, to have peaceful conflict resolution. This should be basic stuff on the national level. You would think national leaders understand conflict resolution, but it turns out not as much. We call for everyone, especially nations, to provide leadership, education, structures, and funds for resolving conflict and for training conflict resolution. And we ask that nations do so with the same commitment that they prepare people with to settle disputes with military force. If we invested and trained people sufficiently, right, with the same level of investment that we have for military conflict, in order to avoid military conflict, we would be able to avoid much more military conflict, right? If we were really invested in nonviolent resolution, things would become different. And this ties, we've already hit on it, all these things tie into economic justice, which is inseparable from peace. Economic justice and peace belong together. Massive hunger and poverty, alongside abundance and wealth, violate the bonds of our common humanity. Such economic disparities are a cause of conflict and war and spur our efforts to build just economic relationships necessary for peace. Justice points toward an economy orders in ways that respect human dignity, provide the necessities of life, distribute goods and burdens fairly and equitably, and are compatible with a life-sustaining ecosystem. Remember we talked about creation? Here it comes again. And we'll talk about economic life later on this week. So you see again how these things are all intertwined. An unsustainable economy will never result in peace and therefore cannot be just. An economy built on violating human dignity, such as an economy built on slavery, for example, to pick a low-hanging fruit, can never establish justice and therefore can never be peace establishing. An economy that does not provide the necessities of life, where people are starving, you're going to not have peace because folks are starving. Folks are not getting what they need to live. An economy that does not distribute goods and burdens fairly and equitably will not result in peace because it is not resulting in justice. Sustainable growth and fair distribution are vital in creating economic justice. Both should enable all to participate in the economy. Global economic integration should enhance economic well-being among and within nations. Fiscal policy, business practices, investment policies, and personal lifestyles, including patterns of consumption, should contribute to economic justice and the long-term sustainability of our planet. And so we support just arrangements to regulate the international economy. The international economy cannot be allowed to be unaccountable. Lack of accountability can be a source of injustice and violent conflict. We support efforts by nations to improve regulation and coordination of the global economy through reciprocal and mutually advantageous arrangements, right? Trade agreements that are just by the standards we've just outlined, right? Preventing commercial wars among the nations, protecting the environment, providing assistance with debt management, checking abuse by multinational companies, protecting poor nations, right? We support the revitalization of aid, especially as we are one of the richer countries. We support continued and increased assistance by the United States and call for its gradual realignment towards more development assistance and proportional reduction in subsidies to purchase weapons, right? We'd much rather have the United States reduce its aid towards people to purchase weapons and increase its aid for development in economics. Because an economically prosperous nation will be much less likely to descend into war. The guiding purpose of economic assistance should be to reduce hunger and poverty and sustain in sustainable and environmentally sound ways. Aid should be provided in ways that promote human rights and build self-reliant individuals, communities, and nations. Aid should be responsive to the needs of many countries to reduce population pressure through greater opportunity for women and through voluntary, safe, and reliable means of birth control. There it is. Remember we talked about that in abortion? There it is again. Again, it's all interwoven. Aid should also require accountability on the part of the recipient governments. We also support economic conversion, right? The United States should evaluate carefully the balance between legitimate security needs and other priority uses of government resources and revenues, and reduce military expenditures whenever possible. Where reductions occur, communities, businesses, and governments on all levels have responsibility to develop strategies that contribute to the well-being of those who bear the greatest burden of this economic conversion, right? So, a de-escalation of the military-industrial complex and an escalation of our investment in supportive economics that create life. And finally, this leads, of course, to political questions. We advocate the strengthening of international cooperation, right? That states are to abstain from the threat or use of military force outside of the right of self-defense and the resistance of aggression, right? Would that we held all our partners on the international stage accountable to that standard? Would that we ourselves met it? When a state massively violates the fundamental rights and freedoms of its people, particularly with acts of genocide, does the principle of non-intervention still hold? In our judgment, it does not. Because of its responsibility for human rights, the international community, through its regional and global organizations, has an obligation to respond and a right to intervene with military force if necessary. Yet any such intervention must be carried out with extreme caution and be accountable to the principles of the just or unjust war tradition. We talked about that in our video yesterday. In support for international cooperation, we call for building confidence through forms of state conduct that are legal, nonviolent, truthful, reliable, and open, minimizing all forms of covert action. Nota bene, CIA. We advocate increased respect for and adherence to international law. Nota bene, the entire U.S. government. We support viable long-term efforts to strengthen the United Nations as a forum for international cooperation and peace, including an International Court of Justice and regional courts. We support creation of an international criminal court, which would hold individuals accountable for violations of international law, for example, in cases of genocide and war crimes. And we encourage continuing deliberation on the international community's responsibility for internal conflicts, right? So all of these things are international policy questions. And if you're an international policy person, I'm sure that all of that was basic, fair to you. If not, and you're getting lost, I definitely recommend you look at the statement. I definitely recommend that you start looking into the questions of global politics because they're actually quite thorny and they're actually quite delicate. And one of the reasons why the United States is so often finding itself in the last 50 years entangled in no-win scenarios is because of the complexity of global policies, the complexity of those politics, and the forces around which the government, the United States government, is tiptoeing rather than working change. And that's because changing those forces would be massively expensive and difficult. And an investment of that energy is difficult, right? It's difficult to summon the political will to do something that large. But we do think we need to improve structures of common security. And that does not mean, right? That does not mean that we need to create larger military. It means we support without illusions efforts to make stronger and more effective the work of the United Nations and regional bodies in preventative diplomacy, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. We understand the United States Armed Forces have a role in the structures of common security. But this role requires the United States to maintain sufficient armed forces to participate effectively in common efforts to deter or defeat likely threats. Although this involvement entails a significant burden on our country, strengthening regional and global security structures is, in our judgment, in the long-term interests of the United States as well as other nations. And so that means we need to give high priority to arms control and reduction. We particularly give priority to agreements among the leading nuclear powers to reduce their nuclear stockpiles and decrease the possibility of nuclear confrontation or accident, the successful negotiation of a renewed nuclear nonproliferation treaty, treaties to ban the production, sale, and use of biological and chemical weapons, and agreements to ban the production, sale, and use of landmines. We also advocate for the control and reduction of the arms trade. Heavily armed nations continue to spend billions on arms. As one of the world's leading arms exporters, the United States has special responsibility to reduce these arms sales and seek proper international control agreements over the worldwide sale and transfer of arms by the major exporters. We support legislation to prohibit the United States military assistance and arms transfers to governments that use them to oppress their own citizens or engage in acts of aggression. Oh, you didn't know that we equip countries that do war crimes? Well, guess what we do? We encourage international efforts to make arms sales open to bulk scrutiny and to reduce the arms trade in general. We advocate participatory and accountable political structures within nations. We call for assistance to nations struggling to form democracies. We acknowledge the responsible use of sanctions may on occasion be the most effective and least harmful measure to lead states to stop oppressing their own people. And we insist that one of the most important contributions the United States can make to have peace is to have its own democracy work for a just and peaceful ordering of its own diverse society, right? So remember, we have to take care of our government. You want to talk about America first? How about democracy in America first? Remember, this statement is from 1995. All of these priorities are quite old and quite predate the current political climate. We encourage non-governmental organizations in their work for peace. This is kind of obvious. Obviously, it's good to have these things. We want to further the role churches play in the worldwide network of communication in the defense of human rights. We encourage people to become active supporters of one or more such NGOs. We call upon nations to protect by law and nurture in their culture the freedom of the citizens to join together in voluntary association, and we support the emerging forms of service in which teams of highly trained volunteers seek peace through nonviolent intervention in conflicted and war-torn areas of the world. This is all really good stuff. Governments honestly could learn a thing or two from some of the NGOs. We encourage and support nonviolent action. We call for education about nonviolence in the church and elsewhere. We encourage members of our church to give conscientious consideration to participation in nonviolent action in situations where it holds promise of being appropriate and effective, right? We provide pastoral support for those who, in conscience, undertake nonviolent action for peace, including those who do so in symbolic ways to dramatize an evil and to witness to the power of the cross of Christ. Nonviolent action, like, protests. Care for the uprooted, right? We care for refugees. There are tens of millions in foreign lands. We support compassionate survival assistance to refugees and vigorous international protection for them. In our own country, we support a generous policy of welcome for refugees and immigrants. We pledge to continue our church's historic leadership in caring for refugees and immigrants. Note that well, by the way, because it's the closest we're going to get, I think, in the social statements to a statement on immigration, because it was assumed, at least in 1995, this was self-explanatory. We support just official, legal, democratic immigration and care for refugees. To the standards that I understand the ELCA has, no administration has met those standards since I've been alive, and I remember the Reagan days, though only vaguely. So not since the 80s at the minimum. So our nation has a long way to go to measure up to the ELCA's social statement. Not only in terms of our international diplomacy, but in terms of our own internal policies and politics. Where does all of this lead us? It means that we await the fulfillment of God's promise of eternal peace, not resigned to the fact that we won't have it until then, but in grateful joy and active hope for our time and place are also God's. God, who makes earthly peace possible, calls us to gather into worship. And when we do the liturgy and when we disperse, we trust that the peace of God in Christ Jesus surpasses all understanding and goes with us and prepares us to be peacemakers, right? This is all call to action stuff, right? How we engage with NGOs, how we teach and advocate conflict resolution nonviolently, even within our church communities, can have a true effect on the global community. So I want to leave you with, as we close this chapter on peace and look forward tomorrow to opening the chapter on economic life, I want you to be encouraged to hear that you are ordained as a peacemaker in the Church of Jesus Christ, that God has chosen you as someone to work for peace in this world, that you are able to do so. You may not be the President of the United States or an international policymaker. You may not be an arms dealer who can change around what their policies are. You may not be even a state mayor, a local mayor or a state governor. You may not have as much power as those people, quote unquote, but you are going to engage across difference. You are going to learn whether or not you can lead peacemaking with people who are different from you, with people with whom you have conflict, with people of whom you have every reason to be afraid, with people who perhaps threaten you. You have the ability to train yourself to learn the biblical values and insights that equip Christians to do peacemaking in a violent world. And I hope that you will join the Jesus movement in working for peace. And I hope that you'll join me tomorrow as we begin our conversation on economic justice. Till then, God bless.